Hey there, I'm Osman Faruqi, host of The Drop, a weekly culture show from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Every episode, I'll be breaking down the latest in the world of TV, film, music, and pop culture, with the help of some of the best writers and critics in the country. Sometimes we go deep.
There's a thrill in seeing what's meant to be private out publicly.
But mostly, we have fun.
I love her asking Logan for a selfie and saying, congrats on the deal, ka-ching.
And there's never been a better time to start listening to The Drop. Right now, we're breaking down every episode of the final season of Succession. Follow The Drop with me, Osman Faruqi, in your favourite podcast app.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, May 16th. Thanks to recent queries from an independent senator, we now know that nearly 1,800 people have been granted access to lobby our federal government. The kicker? We don't know who they are. Under a system that is now under great scrutiny, these people have unfettered access to the private corridors of Parliament House in Canberra. With their bright orange passes granted to them by politicians, they have the ability to wander into the offices of ministers, backbenchers, and independents at any hour. Today, Chief Political Correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, David Crowe, on why we're prevented from knowing who is influencing those in power and just how serious a threat this might be to our democracy. So, David, if I was a lobbyist working in Australia right now, say for a coal company or for a climate change action group or maybe a building developer, what could I do if I wanted to access Parliament House? I mean, just how easy is it?
It's pretty easy because the one hurdle that you would need to jump over is a personal connection with somebody who's an elected member in Parliament, an MP or a senator. Once they've authorised your pass, you're in. You do have to do other things like register at the lobbyist register, simply to disclose that you're doing that. But it's the pass that gets you in. There are different coloured-coded passes in Parliament House for different people. Journalists are yellow, ministerial staffers have a colour, bureaucrats who work for the department have a different colour, but it's the orange one that's available for, could be family, it could be people who need a short-term visit to the building, but it also includes lobbyists. So we know that there are a large number of them. We don't know exactly how many of them are lobbyists. Once you're in the building, you've got unfettered access around the building, and it means that you've got that immensely valuable, direct, face-to-face opportunity with the people who are elected and to make the huge decisions. You can go on down the corridor and knock on somebody's door and seek their time, if they're willing to give it to you, to talk about the issue that you're prosecuting.
So if this was me, I can just knock on Senator Jackie Lambie's door and just be like, hey, I think coal's great.
You could absolutely do that. Whether the door would be slammed in your face is another matter, because some of them won't take kindly to being interrupted. But you can walk down the corridor, knock on any door you like.
And so how come we don't know how many of them are lobbyists? This seems like it goes against common sense, that we should know this.
We didn't even know how many had this pass until one member of the Senate, David Pocock, an independent for the ACT, put in a request for this information, and he'd learned that there were 1,791 passes, orange passes, that had been authorised since this Parliament took shape after the election. So that's the total number. Of course, there are earlier ones who had their passes already before the election because these passes last for 3 years. But even then, it doesn't tell you how many of them are lobbyists, and it doesn't break it down, and it certainly doesn't divulge any names. So there is this air of mystery about how many of these people have got access to Parliament House. Some of them are people who are thoroughly legit, you might say, because they're people who had security clearances while in government. Now they're lobbyists. But the thing is, there's no transparency about how many there are, who's authorised them, and so forth.
Can you paint a picture for us? Who are the big lobbying groups in Australia, potentially knocking on the doors of our politicians?
The quieter ones are the private firms, many of them linked indirectly or sometimes directly to political parties because they're led by people who've been politicians in the past or senior advisors in the past. Former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne is a lobbyist. Former Defence Personnel Minister Alan Griffin, a Labor minister, is a lobbyist. Stephen Conroy, former Communications Minister during the Labor government under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, is on the lobbyist register because he's an advisor to one of the firms. These are the kinds of people who are active in lobbying, but it's not just about former politicians. If you're in Parliament House one day and Parliament is sitting, you'll see anybody ranging from somebody representing a defence industry company, somebody representing the gas industry, somebody representing the Australia Institute, a progressive think tank, somebody representing activist groups that want to shut down the gas industry, and social services groups as well, who've been very active in recent weeks leading up to the budget on issues like increasing job seeker. This is the range of people that you get, and the only way they can get inside Parliament House is to get an orange pass.
Interesting. So can you tell us about the history of lobbying in Australia? How long has this been going on for, and what have some of the consequences have been? Just so we can better understand just how potentially dangerous it is when there is a lack of transparency about just who is lobbying our politicians.
It's been going on since the day dot. It is an accepted part of the Westminster parliamentary culture that, well, really any democracy, access to elected representatives is part of the system. But lobbying itself is embedded in the Westminster system, and the term itself comes from the fact that in London, in Westminster, there is a lobby where only a certain number of people can get access, and that was where people buttonholed politicians when they were coming out of the chamber. That's the origin of the term, and that reflects the fact that it's always been part of the system. And so that's the nature of it. The regulation of it really is only a more recent issue. Even transparency about it is still not up to scratch in Australia compared to other countries. In Canada, for instance, they've got an office of the Commissioner of Lobbying, a sort of a central agency at the federal level that looks at the issues, sets the rules, does investigations, is in charge of registration and compliance. In Australia, we have a lobbyist register. So those who are engaged in lobbying voluntarily put themselves forward and register themselves. That's a publicly available register, which is how you know who's doing lobbying. But of course, it's a voluntary system.
And the issue of lobbying and conflicts of interest have recently been in the news with headlines about former Cabinet Minister Stuart Robert. He's just announced he's going to leave federal politics after 16 years, and I understand he's now facing questions from a parliamentary committee about whether he helped a friend secure federal government contracts. So can you tell me about that?
The reasons for his resignation in his statement, and that's, he feels like the time is up and he's going to spend more time with his family. The issue with his friendships, his connections, have been there throughout a lot of his career. He lost his ministerial position at one point because he went to China, not in his official capacity, but I think as a result of a friendship with an Australian businessman. That's a good example of something that raises eyebrows in the federal government. The proof of that is the fact that he lost his job. More recently, we've been looking at one of his friends who's in a consulting firm. This person's name is David Milo. He runs a consulting firm called Synergy 360. Stuart Robert insists there's nothing wrong here. He hasn't used that friendship in any untoward way, kept his ministerial job separate from his friendship with his consulting mate. And David Milo says he hasn't done anything wrong. But in the course of looking at that, it's often raised the question of whether the consulting firm is actually a lobbyist. But it's not registered on the lobbyist register because that's largely voluntary.
Okay, and can you tell us a bit about how these lobbying efforts, how they actually affect us on a day-to-day basis on the ground? I mean, potentially it's literally affecting the air that we breathe with, you think about the Howard government and how arguably climate change policy was affected by fossil fuel lobbyists. So can you sort of take us into that a bit?
It affects every policy decision in the end, or has an influence on them, or the potential to influence those decisions. The scale of that influence you can never really be sure about. I mean, the bigger influence is clearly what's happening in the chamber, in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, and that's the outcome of electoral decisions, the will of the Australian people. But there is a nexus between lobbying and donations, and that nexus is a cause for concern, and that's why we're seeing people starting to speak up about the connections here and speaking up in favour of greater transparency about the system, because it's quite feasible for a policy to be strongly influenced by a lobbyist who's also a former member of Parliament with a lot of political connections and who's also donating to a political party to get an outcome or to support that political cause. So that's the nexus that we've got in the system right now. And the only solution really at this point is greater transparency about that system.
Okay. And so the push for more transparency by a crossbench alliance led by Independent Senator David Pocock, what exactly is he calling for?
The call is for transparency. The call isn't even to say, look, stop these people coming into Parliament House. Pretty much throughout the building, there's an acceptance of the idea that people should be able to come and talk to politicians. You can't really have a system where the wall outside the building was so high that nobody could get in to talk. And that's true of a social services group that might be lobbying on JobSeeker, through to the gas industry that's saying, look, we want to say about some of the regulations and the price controls that you're bringing in. Transparency is what David Pocock and others are after, which is simply tell us the names of the lobbyists who've got these passes, who are in Parliament House, and also when an MP or a senator authorises one of these passes, that should be public as well. We know that there's one particular politician in Parliament House who's authorised more than 50 passes. We don't know who that person is. Should we know it? The argument from David Pocock and most of the crossbenchers is that should be transparent. However, there is another side to that argument, and that's why it hasn't been done in a swift way. It's still up for debate. And the debate is over privacy. Should the MP have to disclose every pass that they authorise? I can see why they wouldn't want to disclose friends or family members. But what if that person is a lobbyist? Should they have to disclose that? At the moment, there's what you might call institutional resistance to that idea in Parliament House, that might go too far.
So, David, what are the potential reforms or changes that you think we should be looking to see that would remedy all the problems that we've spoken about?
Well, I reckon we're in for a long debate about some changes that are concrete and could make a difference. First of all, of course, is expanding the lobbyist register so that in-house lobbyists who work for companies rather than their own shops would have to register. So you get a better picture of who's doing it. Transparency about who's in Parliament House, of course. Donations reform is still fundamental. Foreign donations have been stopped, but there's still not enough transparency in real time about where the money is coming from and who's it going to. The more transparency you have about the donations, the more certainty you can have about whether that's been used to lobby on particular issues. So donations reform is really fundamental. And you would certainly want to have greater policing of the lobbying system. I mentioned, for instance, the commission in Canada. Something like that could then make sure that if somebody's not registered, that they're made to register, that it's not just a voluntary system with no sanctions for those who don't bother to comply.
Okay. So what strikes me, David, listening to all of this is that it really feels like this is something that a lot of people don't know about. And when they hear it, they're really shocked. And it may even undermine what little faith they have left in our political system. So what's at stake if this doesn't change?
I guess what's at stake is trust in the political system, which we know has been under pressure for years now. But what's at stake also, more importantly, I would say, is the robustness of the decisions that are made in Canberra. You want a system that makes decisions fairly in the interests of all. I think, I'm not a conspiracy theorist about lobbyists. I see them as part of the system. They've always been there. They'll probably always be there. But you want a system that's transparent, where you've got greater trust in its ability to make a fair decision. And if you've got secrecy about access, then you've got question marks about the way in which decisions are made. And that's bad for the system as a whole.
Thanks, David.
Not at all. Great to talk. Thanks.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.